Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nisha Manek.
I'm so delighted to be here, really. Every time I come to Austin, I love coming here because every time I come, there's a kind of vibrancy, of vitality that is so unique to this place. And then you come to the Unity Church, and then you magnify that. It's awesome. So thank you, and Joe and Lynn, come on, this is amazing. You've done an amazing thing. It takes a lot of courage to reach out. And then, you get doors sort of, I don't think so. Austin, give me a break. But when he called, and I was actually in Singapore, and he said something about subtle energies in Tiller, and Tiller celebrated his 90th birthday last week. At 90 years old, and you've had a full career, I think you have a right to just, sit by the fireplace and do more calculations, because he continues to do that. So we're going to explore some very interesting science today. Okay? Because science is about finding the truth. Spirituality is about finding the truth. They're not separate. They're really together. Complementary pathways to knowledge. So I'm thinking about all of these things, and we're going to talk about consciousness, that really amazing question that we all as human beings have. Because there are levels of consciousness. There's a plant, there's a dog, and there's you, and you're the one who writes Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. What makes you different? We're going to actually explore these questions and also look at the more modern take on consciousness, look a little bit at brain science and so forth. Okay? Next, Bill Tiller, my mentor. When I was I had a very successful, or continued to have a very successful medical career. I knew there's much, much more than what modern medicine does, which is chemistry. When I do a blood test, I'm testing your chemistry. When I give you a prescription, I'm doing more chemistry. Everything I learned in medical school was about chemistry. Yes, anatomy and function and all that, but underneath that is biochemistry, okay? It's very powerful. And from that has modern medicine grown. But I knew there's much, much more. There's a big gap in conventional care. We have excellent care here in America, and yet we do not have the outcomes. And I'm a rheumatologist, somebody who looks after patients with chronic diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, chronic pain, gout, lupus, Sjogren's. All of these are the people I look after. And they're the ones who came to me, and I was in a very academic situation. The ivory tower of randomized controlled trials, of data. That's how we do medicine. We look at numbers. And then we try to fit them to you and me. Right? That's how we do medicine. But the patients were telling me something quite different. And many of them were practicing meditation. And I remember one young lady particularly, she sticks out in my mind. And so with my interest in mind-body medicine, I'm an integrative rheumatologist, I was invited to write a book chapter in the Mayo Clinic textbook of complementary medicine. And actually complementary medicine is no longer correct. It should be integrative medicine, which speaks to the fact that conventional care and complementary therapy should work together. We're not opposites, okay? So, and really a lot of people now recognize that, so I will say integrative medicine. So as part of my interest, I was very, very keen to understand subtle energies. The subtle energies are the human biofield. Medicine has a very, very difficult time with this. We have struggled. And we've struggled for more than 2 to 3 decades just to even accept acupuncture. It's the truth. I mean, millions of dollars. And finally, the American Pain Society does recognize it as a legitimate way to alleviate pain. And now we have to get all our tools out there because we have an opioid crisis on our hands. So as part of this book chapter, I was really diving into the randomized control data, right? This is how science is done. It was pretty good. But I wanted to go deeper. I wanted to know, what is this energy? And I came into the work of Bill Tiller. The first paper I held of his, I couldn't understand every 6th or 7th word if I was lucky. But something about that paper told me I have to go to this man. It was an intuition. And so I wrote to him. You were lucky you got a reply. I had nothing for months, but I followed up, and all I knew was he had retired and was living in Scottsdale. And I was giving a lecture in Scottsdale, and I insisted on meeting him, and he finally did. And at that meeting, that dinner meeting in Scottsdale, where Bill Tiller and Jean Tiller were both there, I realized I found my mentor. Because you want to find the truth. You have to have a way. You need a guru. And if you have a guru, hang on to them because they will show you a way forward. And for me, it was science. How do you have science show you things about consciousness and subtle energies? Well, Tiller had balanced both worlds, and he did that exquisitely. Okay? So there was a problem. He told me, go back, you shouldn't meddle in physics. Door closed. Except a few months later, he called me back and said, I've been thinking. Medicine is stuck in chemistry. I think you could communicate to your colleagues something new. So one of those new ideas, I hope we have time tonight, is to open the doorway to a major paradigm shift. Chemical medicine, and bridge it over to information medicine. Okay? So park that. If we get to it, we get to it. If we don't, it's fine. Because in the end, and I was telling this to Joe, the masters are always in charge. Whoever is meant to be here today is you. You were meant to be here today. We cannot control that. I've seen this over and over again, wherever there's a talk or something about the Buddha's relics. And you might be even interested, Buddha's relics to medicine? Oh yeah? Because there is a connection. We tend to silo things. We don't need to do that anymore. Next. Tiller is a master engineer. He was a material scientist and an engineer. That's his background at Stanford. And I'll tell you, an engineer mindset is something that bridges things. He builds physical bridges that you see out there and you go over with your car. But he was bridging concepts, ideas that seem so separate. But in his mind, in his engineering mind, they're not separate. He also has a tremendous expertise. He was the world's expert in crystals, crystallography. Crystals are very special materials because they have atoms arranged in them in a very highly symmetrical fashion. And you know, symmetry in nature gives you a clue to higher realms. And I think Tiller was particularly blessed in this way. In his conventional training, he had engineering mindset. He had the symmetry know-how, which is it's an unusual kind of mathematics. Very few people have that, but he had. But he had another ingredient. He was a highly inner managed individual. How many times do you see science and you have a bodhisattva in the same person. Tiller is a bodhisattva. He just happens to know math. Okay, he could do the links. So he's building a bridge so that science can comfortably cross over to spirit at the other end. Like I told you, they're complementary pathways to knowledge. Okay, next. So this is the connection I'm trying to make. It's a connection few people actually even know about, because we go about our days, we don't think about these things. But science and spirituality are connected, and we will show one way to do that because the relics give us a way. Next question. Okay. And next question. So, I'm going about my business, 2009, and I get a phone call. Nisha, go to Minneapolis because the Buddha's Relics are touring. And I thought, I don't know what relics are. I'm a Hindu. I was raised in Kenya. I'd never even heard about a relic. But what my friend told me got me hooked. She said, they're Buddha's relics and they're on tour. I called that monastery immediately. Next, you can read these slides. Next. So, and next. Okay. In medicine, when I talk about consciousness, the question of consciousness, what do I think about? It's in your skull. How else can it? It's here. And then I went to see the relics. And it was a Sunday. I remembered it so well. My brother was in Minneapolis, St. Paul, flying home to Los Angeles. And I said, hey, Raj, there's a free exhibition of the Buddha's relics. It sounds really cool, just like our thing. We went. Now, before I actually tell you about my experience, I just want to do an experiment. An experiment that, you see, the question of consciousness has always been the realm of philosophy. It's a philosophical question. People sit in armchairs and they discuss philosophy of what is consciousness. That's why I said a plant is consciousness. It grows, have a little sunshine, a little rain. It does things. It's conscious. The dog, the cat, the goldfish, they're conscious. So we have to explore something about consciousness and our perceived notions about it. And actually, there is such science. Philosophy is no longer an armchair science, folks. They are actually leaving their armchairs and doing contemporary science in the field. In other words, we're testing these preconceived notions about consciousness, and it gives a very important clue to why we think the way we do. So next slide. Okay. So suppose you look around your home and you see 4 items. We're going to ask ourselves, what of those 4 items have a mind? You see a picture of your daughter, you see your goldfish, a toaster, and printer cartridges. This has actually been done. Joshua Knobe of Yale University has done this experiment in the field. Now, when you look at the 4 items, immediately you say the conscious things are goldfish and the human. Yeah, pretty obvious. So what? But think about this. How did you decide? How did you decide the human and the goldfish are conscious? And Joshua Knobe says that we decide how something has consciousness based on what it does, okay, its functional thing, and number 2, what it looks like. Those 2 major things, okay? It's simplified, but just hold that. So, next slide. So let's take 2 things from those 4. the toaster and the goldfish. And let's ask the question again, of the two, what has consciousness? And right away you can say, the goldfish, so what? But why do you say that? It's because of what it does, its function, its behavior is complex. Fish food, it talks to you. You might go and tap on the glass, right? The fish behaves in complex ways. The toaster makes toast, right? So, next slide. We figure out whether something has consciousness by its behavior, its function. Okay, that's... All right, next slide. So let's do that experiment again, but this time, the human and a robot. We are in this realm of artificial intelligence. And again, this experiment has been done by experimental philosophy. And what they have said is, just take these two items, a human and a robot, and the robot, made of rubber, silicone, glass, whatever, wires, behaves exactly like the human. Exactly, in every way is human, okay? And they pose the question, does the robot believe it has two eyes? And most people will say, it does. Does the robot believe it has a nose and ears? Most people will say yes to that question. Now, if you ask the question, does the robot feel happy when it gets what it wants? Most people say, no. Notice that. Whenever you have phenomenal consciousness, it seems that our perceptions are, they're tied to the right kind of body. You can have a robot, the right kind of body, but we know it's not got the brain, okay? So it's tied up in there. So, next slide. Yeah. So, it seems that we have a notion that something has phenomenal consciousness, that is feelings, if it has a brain. It really is important. That's an important bias. We need to keep this in mind as we go through the evening, okay? Because we're going to revisit this. So next slide. So Buddha's brain, and this is where, we have studied the brain. We have studied the lamas, the Tibetan lamas, from His Holiness's, he has many of those monks who are literally Olympic athletes when it comes to meditation. 10, 15, 20,000 hours of meditation. And we know their brains are different. They're different than yours and mine. Their frontal lobes look different. Their happiness center looks different. So they are different. There's no question about that. Next slide. And embedded in this data is the fact that when you meditate, you can make your brain better. You can pump up that muscle of happiness, of serenity, of peacefulness. We know that. But I've said we have a bias with all of this brain research. Next slide. Okay. Now, with this question, let's pose the same question with these objects. Do these objects have a mind? Most people say, I don't know, it looks like fish eggs. I really have had that happen. Next slide. What if I told you that these are the relics of the historical Buddha? These are his blood relics, okay? And they're part of the collection that I saw. This picture was provided to me by Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and I can freely use it. So by all means, if you want to take a picture of this holy picture, you can. So this is Buddha's relics. And this is what happened to me. Next slide. As I entered the monastery in Minneapolis that Sunday, as I remember, as I entered the doorway, it was like an immense presence. Immense, like Christ or Buddha was present. And it was a quiet Sunday. There was hardly anyone there. There was the monks on the side, and there was me and my brother. Next slide. The state was exquisite. There was no words to it. It was non-verbal. It was vast than anything I've ever felt. It was firm and gentle, almost paradoxical, but yet it felt familiar, like you'd come home. Next slide. There was a sense of peace, I'm driving from Rochester, the usual crowding things, and it all went. It just dissolved, is the best way I can say. Next slide. Next. Okay. This was amazing. As I looked at the case with Shariputra, Ananda, Moudgalyana, these are disciples, the apostles, if you will, of Buddha, the first Buddhist council, yes? And I sort of knew them when I was little. I used to read books about these teachers. And there was this incredible feeling overcame me, and I literally grabbed the table and I fell to the ground. I was out, gone. I think I was like that for several hours until they closed the monastery. And I realized I couldn't think. I stood by my Jeep and thought, how do you switch this thing on? It was literally you had to call in a thought. Your mind became silent. It was exquisite and very hard to live in this reality, okay? You cannot, if you're suddenly there in that amazing space, it's very hard. And I've seen this over and over again. Next slide. Yeah. This feeling of unity was there. Next slide. So, as we left the monastery, my brother and I made an intention. We're bringing the masters home, whatever that meant. We didn't know. So, we want to bring this to our home. Now, the relic tour had never been in a private residence before. This is nuts. But we wrote a letter to London, and we were granted permission. So the relics came to our home in Los Angeles. Next slide. So that's the poster for it. Next slide. The next series of slides, I may just say next slide, it's the opening ceremony of the relic tour, okay? And this is the head priest right in the front here. Of the Hindu temples in Los Angeles, and behind her is Rinpoche, the head monk of the Minneapolis temple who came to LA to help us. Next slide. This is the case of Shakyamuni relics, and you can see the little magnifying glass where you can really take a good look. Next slide. And within 2.5 days, we had about 3,000 people come through our living room. Just like whole of humanity, dogs, children, wheelchairs, everyone came. And you see their original face as they leave. Original face as they leave. And I was just sitting there. You're a host. And you watch this. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next. Lots of children. And they came to Kenya. Next slide. Yeah. And next slide after that. His Right Honorable Nyaga, he's a Minister of Cultural Affairs in Kenya. He opened the relic tour. And he's somebody who has actually done retreats in yoga. He says, I am so excited to be here. But we had in Nairobi about 5,000 people in a weekend. People were waiting for about 3 hours in line just to be able to come and be blessed from the relics. Next slide. Next slide. There you can see the long lines. Next slide. After the relic tour of Los Angeles, something very interesting happened. We received a phone call about a week after the relic tour had finished from this man's wife. And she called and said, and I remember him because he was in a wheelchair and he had the catheters or the site where you do dialysis. And he didn't look well, but he was there. And he was there for much of the day, actually. You know, I kept saying, are you okay? Do you need help? Do you need to lie down? He says, no, I'm so happy to be here. Well, a week later, his renal function, which was at end stage, just healed. I called this nephrologist and I said, Dr. Kabede, tell me, in your professional opinion, how likely is it that somebody's renal function, which is end stage and is on dialysis, would go back to normal? He says, well, in my professional opinion, this was a miracle. I didn't use that word, he did. And I said, well, thank you very much. But this was amazing, you know. People who came through the Los Angeles tour, I could see it. Mental healing, emotional healing, back pain disappearing, shoulders healing. I mean, it was all kinds of stories. So, next slide. This is an amazing picture. Now, you will see, we'll spend just a little time here. You'll notice something. Look here. Look at that golden light. And it's blessing this nun. It's a low resolution picture, but if we had to expand these orbs would be unique orbs to each master, okay? There are a lot of anomalous things that happened around the relic tours. The picture, this was taken by a journalist, and she was really disturbed about her camera. It was brand new. And she kept looking at it and looking at the space and looking at her camera. And my brother says, something seems to be the problem. She says, there are lights in the pictures, but there's nothing here. And he says, let me take a look. And he says, don't delete this. Stop deleting these things. You're capturing something. Her camera had become sensitized. It was a different space, different camera, different everything. So this is a very amazing picture, and he calibrates it on the consciousness. It's like you're looking at God. Don't need a face and I told you, we have a bias with this human flesh and bones. So, beautiful. Next slide. So, ordinary people, I'm no Olympic athlete in meditation, I can assure you, getting these states that, you know, it took me a week, but I had to actually pray for it to be taken away. When you're a physician in a clinic and you can't understand language, it was blah, 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 blah. It was like that. And I had to tell my patients, slow down, I can't understand you. I can't understand you. Just hold on. And they said something about you is different. And for them, it was very natural. Oh, yeah, this happened to me in church, or this happened to me in a prayer group. It was very interesting. Patients are very open. They got this. But the exceptional healings, is this the brain, or is this something else? And I think we have to question. We have to question the role of the brain and our current way of investigating consciousness. The brain is very important. It's an impressive wiring system. Impressive. We can change things. We can, make it do things with psychedelics. But it is chemistry, my friends. and this is not where consciousness abides. Because the relics are very conscious things. Next slide. So we're talking about mind beyond the body. This is a radical idea, okay? But I think once you begin to do that, now we are way forward. Beyond MRI machines and pretty pictures. They're important, but that's not the whole answer. Next slide. So the first theme was a consciousness beyond the body, beyond the brain. Just park that. So the next question is, can formless things like loving kindness, how can you put that in an object? An object like a relic, or this pen, or this thing. How can you imprint that and it be stable for a long, can it even be done? I mean, that's consciousness. We're not locked into a brain, now we're asking a bigger question. Next slide. To be able to ask such a question, you need a scientist who has the adequate tools, both in the outer realm. Outer realm means he needs to know engineering. He needs to know mathematics. He needs to know statistics. He needs to know how to set up a protocol. And he needs to do all of this without large, proton colliders. We're not talking about quantum mechanics here. We are not talking about the brain. We don't want MRI machines. So it needs a very sophisticated mind. A mind who can bring that outer knowledge and the inner knowledge seamlessly together. And this is the concept of adequatio. How many times have we asked what our scientists, are they really ready to give us the answers? Or are they the geeks in the labs? We need to have scientists who are really awake to ask the really important questions. So the kind of device, Tiller was the one who took this question and said, okay, let's test consciousness out. And he's a material scientist. He's an expert in materials. He knows. So if he looks at this water, he just doesn't see a colorless fluid of this and, quenches your thirst and we can make a nice cup of tea. He sees something much, much more. To a material scientist's mind, this is like a canvas. Let's see what we can do with this water. And what he decided to do was change its pH with nothing but his intention. Now just think about it for a moment. We're in this lab in Stanford and got all these meters and gauges and stuff, and he made this other condition. If we test our consciousness, it has to be with regular instruments. I told you, no Large Hadron Colliders and MRI machines. Regular things you can find in any lab. So it's replicable. That's pretty courageous. So he decided to do target experiments. The first target was water. And he wanted to change the pH of the water. And he realized that you cannot just sit there and intend forever for this water to change its pH. You need a way to objectify your intention. You need a way to measure it. And so he decided to do a really crazy protocol. And in fact, I do have, I have a device, but it's in Joe's home. In all my hurry, I came here. But it looks just like that. It looks pretty much, just think, this is your device, okay? We're going to pretend this is our device. So this is what he did. The first experiment was to change the pH of water, 1 pH up or 1 pH down from neutral pH, okay? That's a huge signal. You're not talking little noise, random effects. We're talking huge signal. So he wasn't shy about saying, I'm going to change the pH of water without any chemical additions, with just purely intention. And intention is your consciousness at work. Okay? Next slide. And this is how he imprinted the device. He took 3 other Stanford graduate students. And they look ordinary people, wear jeans, t-shirts, they're brainiacs, but inside, they were like yogis. Tiller insisted any student that he mentored have a practice of meditation. And even when I went to him, he said, Nisha, I will not work with you unless you begin to do regular meditation. For him, meditation isn't just about relaxation, it's a science protocol. I told you, science and spirit, for him, are inseparable. You have to do both. Back. Okay. So here we are. This device, is sitting in the table. I'm sorry about my pointer. It's not very bright, but there you are. So they'd clear a space in the lab. They'd clear the table, and 4 of them would sit down around the device, and they're sitting there on the table. And they read the intention statement. Tiller created that the pH of this water will go up. The hydrogen ion, to use material science language, will go up by a factor of so much for 1 full pH change. That was his intention. I intend that I will get, my book published in 2019. That's my intention. So we take action. You write it down. And that's what he did. He wrote his intention down. Even his experiment, the water, write it down. And then they hold one thought, that one thought, not for 5 minutes, not for 10 minutes, and I've been on these imprinting sessions. 45 minutes. Can you hold a thought for 45 minutes? I can't. My one eye is like, is the time up? And I realized I cannot be part of this imprinting team. And he even told me, I don't think so, Nisha. You just go write those papers or something. So, in that lab, for 45 minutes, they hold one thought, change the pH of water, whatever, And this is amazing what Tiller said at the end of that statement, thy will be done. I have never heard that in a science protocol. Clinical science, thy will be done. He's asking for the truth to be shown to him. Don't you see that? Thy will be done. He was open to complete failure. It doesn't matter. But thy will be done. I mean, I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about these kinds of protocols. It's fantastic. Next. So that's the intention statement, and it's really reads like a science thing. Don't worry. Next. He takes this imprinted thing, wraps it in aluminum foil because you want to protect it from light and leakage, information leakage, and shipped it to Minnesota. The receiving lab had no idea of the directive of that intention. They didn't know if the pH was supposed to go up or down or what. No idea. They unwrap this thing, and then they plug it next to a bottle or a container of water. Not touching, just that, like that. That's it. pH is monitored. That's your experimental setup. How simple can you get? Frugal science. Okay? We're going to see if this thing works. It took a little while, initially, a few weeks, 6 weeks, 2 months, and this is what happened. Next slide. This is what happened. Can you believe this? Can you believe this? Somebody changed the pH of water with a device. His intention worked. What about lowering the pH? Next. And he's done this hundreds of times. Okay? hundreds of times. It's really, when I saw this day, at first I thought, change water with a device. I mean, how silly is this? But it's not silly. This is showing something that with your intention, you have the ability to change materials. And water is human being. That is our biology. It's aqueous. And from water comes enzymes. From enzymes comes whole living beings. This, if you can do this, and he did do that. He did do enzyme, alkaline phosphatase, and then he went on to show his intention with a living fruit fly, a whole living system. And what's interesting with the fruit fly, if I may share a little story, Tiller does not wish to harm any animal. In medicine, we do a lot of things to animals. Okay? Tiller, the way he constructed his statements was such that the fruit fly would thrive, would mature faster, be happier fruit flies. I mean, okay, I thought, wow, okay. That shows the kind of heart of a scientist. Next slide. This thing is not inert anymore. We think it's, in my medical mind, these things are there, objects, toasters, printer cartridges. So what? It's not so what. In Tiller's labs and in his hands, these things are not inert. They're metastable. That's a thermodynamic term. It's excited beyond its ground state. And as the subtle energy leaks away, it returns to ground state where no change happens to the material. Okay? So I hope if there's one thing you can take away, objects can be metastable by our actions. They are excited by our intention. So it's not an inert piece of object at all. Next. There was something else he monitored. Whenever you do experiments, changing materials, you want, especially, monitoring water pH, exquisitely 0.01 pH unit, that's pretty detailed. It's not a litmus paper. This is a digital monitor. You want to monitor the lab environment, its temperature, its, the water pH, how it responds. You need to know your environment to some extent. That's thermodynamics, okay? That's what he did. And something very odd was going on in that lab space. Folks, this is amazing, because this is the bridge to understanding the relics. So listen up. If you're falling asleep at the back, now you can wake up. Okay. Next slide. Okay. Temperature fluctuations, very rhythmic, like ba-doom, ba-doom. Look at this. This is not a normal air current. I mean, we can all feel the air conditioning here. If you put a meter, it's all over. It's not like this. This is very anomalous. And a huge amount. This is not random air. And if you wanted to know, if this is truly, air currents doing funky things, you put a fan. Next slide. If it was air currents, you put a fan, what would happen? Obliterate these immediately. No, they continued. This was not air. This was something else. This is what we call physicist gold. You have stumbled into something that has not been observed in nature thus far. It's non-dispersive. This medium, whatever it is non-dispersive. You can put a fan, you can do whatever you want. The waves, they're non-dispersive. That's another word. It's a thermodynamic word. And when he looked at the water temperature and the pH, it was doing anomalous behavior too, very rhythmic. Okay? This is really odd. Next slide. Now, you can take those waveforms and do a mathematical technique called Fourier transform, routine stuff. And Fourier is a kind of calculation where you take complex waveform and you condense you extract vital information. So that's what Tiller did. He's a mathematical genius, you know. Next slide. And this is what he found. The air temperature, the water temperature, the water pH all nested. Like, look at that. It's like the whole room is pulsing, singing, or doing something. And the materials were like harmonics. Yeah, that's a good word. Harmonics. Next slide. Your intention matters. And intention does work. When I say work, I don't mean it works. It has energy to perform some work. If you want to change water's pH in your lab, you have to put some energy in it. You have to zap the water. And people do this. You know, you can put chemicals in it, or you put electric rods in it, and you have some energy, and you will have hydrogen ions, and you have altered the pH water. Where did this energy come from? Intention was working. It was a source of energy. Energy of a very different kind. Next slide. Okay, so I have to give you a little background into thermodynamics. So forgive this little technicality, but I think you'll have fun. And you don't need to know math. Next slide. It's not quantum theory. Nope, thank God. Next slide. It's the law. Thermodynamic is the law. Folks, if there's the third thing you can write, please write thermodynamic is the law. Next slide. And this is the law that scientists trust more than any other. Quantum theory, even look at that, theory. It's incomplete. Terrific theory. Has really helped us usher in 21st century, but it is a theory. It's still being worked on. There's lots of holes in it. Thermodynamics has been called the Shakespeare's of science. Okay, next slide. So you don't need mathematics. I mean, hey, I don't have pedagogy in physics. I had to sit with books and Next slide. But I remember the day, this is Tiller's writing. He came, he puts his brown hat, we used to meet every Thursday, he puts his hat down there, and I said, okay, what are we going to talk about today? He says, thermodynamics, and he pulled out this paper and he wrote this, and I thought, oh boy. Okay, he says, Nisha, learn thermodynamics because it's the law. Everything, closed systems, open systems, human systems, your brain system, your steam engine, it's the same. It all obeys the law, and it's true. I was going to launch into a story about Dan Brown's new book, Origins, which is based on thermodynamics, okay? That the MIT physicist Jeremy England has shown that you can use thermodynamic laws to create self-organizing systems in the lab. Hello, folks. We can put a bunch of soup in a petri dish and put energy on it, and guess what it does? It becomes molecules that we recognize as the first primordial molecules, all based on thermodynamics. Thermodynamics is old science, isn't it? And I thought, and I looked at it, are you kidding me? What? Next slide. So we'll just go over how to not, what's it's all about. Not dive into all the math. You don't need that, and I can't do it. Next. So, steam engines, next, and the brain, yeah, they all obey the law, okay? It looks so different, but they're not. Next. And like any Shakespeare drama, you have an international. I've spent more time with these dudes up there than I care to, Ludwig Boltzmann, Hosea Willard Gibbs, Rudolf Clausius, James Maxwell. These are amazing, okay? Next slide. Essentially, this is the law, okay? G is Gibbs free energy. Anytime you want to do work, you need Gibbs free energy from some source. And in the engine, it's pressure and volume, internal energy, temperature, and entropy. Next slide. So when you have a steam engine, you heat up water, steam expands, increases pressure, and drives an engine. I mean, literally, that's the concept. Internal energy, E. Of course, this is E equals mc squared. Next slide. The very famous energy and mass equivalence of Einstein. Next slide. So let's just hold this slide. I have told you that when you increase or change pH of water, you need some energy. And you can do calculations. This is actually standard mathematics, nothing genius. If you want to change pH by 1 unit up, you need this much energy, delta G of 24 milliequivalent volts. Okay? Oh. So we have to ask ourselves, where did that energy come from? What's this thing and this? How did this change? Where's this energy coming from? Next slide. So we have to say, did the pressure in the room change? No. The volume change? Did the room fly apart? No. Did the internal energy change somehow? No. Temperature? The temperature was, it did those oscillations, but it was otherwise not burning up or cooling down. Where did this energy come from? And there could only be one place. Next slide. Entropy. Entropy. Next slide. Entropy is one of the most confusing thermodynamic terms because there's so many interpretations, but essentially entropy means disorder. Disorder is more likely than order. Next slide. Your cup of coffee has delta G in it, and it cools off over time. And it loses that energy, but it never goes back. You don't see a cold item giving heat to a hotter item. That's essentially the second law in a nutshell, okay? So entropy is very interesting because that's related to information. Next slide. And information, this is why we have our information age is Claude Shannon. Next slide. So actually, I translated Claude Shannon, father of information theory, into zeros and ones, bits, So that you can do that. You can write Claude Shannon, translate to Swahili, and you'll get that. You can do, bits, and you'll get that. So it's pretty cool. Next slide. Hold that. It takes energy to put things away. And if I had a messy office, I could just put things away. But you need information to make sense of that energy. You need both. So it's a simplistic way to look at the connection between energy and information, but I think it gets the point across. And Tiller's office does look like that. Next. So we come to this question, what does consciousness do? Next. We are creating that information. We are writing change of pH. We're writing, I want to do this or that. I want to achieve this or that. We are looking at the stars at the night and we make order out of disorder. We are creating, Taurus and Virgos from the points of light in our sky. We are creating order all the time. It's the human mind. Next. But we come back to this question of space. Because I've told you, there is a bridge here from that space that Tiller found, that what he calls space conditioning, and what the relics did. Next, let's go to the most important thing. Okay, this graph simply shows that we are over here, unconditioned, uncoupled. So in my lab, if I did this experiment, I would be over here, U1 gauge. It's just, gauge theory talks about symmetries, and even space has symmetries. The physical vacuum has symmetries. And when I talk about the vacuum, there's no physical stuff. Doesn't mean there's no stuff. There's no electrons and things that we normally think about as matter, okay? So you have normal reality, and then you have the higher reality, which is to the right here. Next. So let's look at this question about Tiller's work, and now let's look at the relics. And look at the similarities. The relics are like a device. 2,600-year-old device, and it's still going strong. Its half-life is who knows how many more centuries. It's wrapped and protected in a case and brought from city to city for the tours. Tiller's device, simple electric device, it's wrapped and protected, and it's transported to Minnesota for the experiment. Can you see the similarities here? A human did this, and an avatar did this kind of a device, but they are devices. Next. Tiller always says that his device is like Model T. And I thought, okay, then Buddha Relics is like the Pagani car. I was in Beverly Hills a few months ago, and I don't know if anyone's seen a Pagani, and I went, oh, whoa, that's awesome. That's an awesome car. So I just thought, it's not a Ferrari or Lamborghini, it's a Pagani, okay? So the Buddha's Relics and the Tiller, it was just a fun little slide I put together. Okay, next. I'm glad you get the humor in there. So the question then is, do the Buddha's relics condition the space? Because I gave you a number of the delta G of just changing one pH unit of 24 milli-electron volts. So let's ask that question. Next. This is our living room in Los Angeles. And as the case came home that night, this is what it felt like within a few seconds. Next. It felt like this. Go back. Go back. This is where we have coffee and read newspapers. Wall Street Journal, to be exact. Next. And this is what it felt like. The light bulbs went, pew, our toaster busted. It was so incredible. I mean, really. But notice, a few seconds. Tiller's device took 6 weeks to, up to 2 months initially. Now his labs are conditioned. They're doing things, okay? They're just conditioned, and he's able to pump it up with his intention. Space is the important bit. So this is what we did. Next slide. I took several of the Tiller devices when the relics came home. I put them under the table. I didn't make any intention. I felt that my action was my intention expressing itself. And so for the whole 3 days that the relics were home, the devices were there. In being imprinted with that loving kindness energy. I should really say information. That's a more accurate word. Next. So I gave one of this relic imprinted device to Dr. Tiller, and I said, let's try. Because you're saying something happens to your space, and we can quantify that conditioning. And it seems to me that the relics have a very robust response. And so we did. First, we measured the background of the casita. It was a small room in Scottsdale, and nothing, usual current, nothing interesting was going on. It was completely ordinary space. And then Tiller put the device and the water. Because the theory is if you condition the space, the water pH is going to change. And so we were very excited, so excited. I thought, oh man, this is awesome experiment, No brain, tabletop, we're going to get an amazing answer. And then nothing happened. Nothing happened. It was really devastating And then I remember this morning, I remember the morning in Scottsdale when the answer came to me. And I bet some of you already got the answer too. We are living in U1 gauge, normal reality. This is where particle physics and, standard model, the Higgs boson, all that is here, okay? U1 gauge. Tiller is on the next realm. It's not electromagnetic anymore. We're talking about non-dispersive mediums and physical vacuum, SU2. But where do you think the relics are? They were much higher. Remember I said we need the right tools. We didn't have adequatio in our own setup. I was relieved. I thought, okay, it's not a failure. This is a great insight. Next slide. So the relics are not at SU2. They're way above. They cannot speak to your little thing and down here, okay? Next slide. This is what Tiller did. Hold this slide. Hold this slide. So I talked to Tiller, and he said, whoa, yeah, talk some more. I think you're onto something. You see, I'm a student of Dr. Hawkins, and I said, there are levels of consciousness, even your instruments, they can't go over there. I mean, Buddha is like he's an avatar, And, you're not an avatar yet. But anyway, he got the joke. He said, okay. He did something. He wrote an intention. And this is exactly what he wrote. We respectfully request that this excess thermodynamic free energy of this loving kindness essence be made manifest in this space, in that casita, so that we can experimentally measure its thermodynamic activity. He asked this device sitting in the casita. And this is what happened. Next. This is when nothing is happening, you can see. Weeks, nothing. I'm going, oh my God, this is horrible. And then I get the insight, and he writes that statement, and then look at what happened to the pH. It took off like a rocket. And he even called me, Nisha, the pH has gone crazy, it's going up. I said, whoa, next slide. Next slide. When he started to take off, we only kept the meter on for about 2 weeks. We got our answer. It would have kept going, but it changed 2 pH units in 2 weeks. That's huge. Now you can have some calculations. Now we can put some numbers to that loving kindness. Next slide. So we go back to that 2 pH units. We know it needs about 60 electron volts to change that pH. The pressure in the casita didn't change, the volume didn't change, the internal energy didn't change, the thermal thing you can calculate, and it would have required 700 degrees centigrade to produce that pH change. It's like love was actually it burns, okay? But, so what happened? Next. It wasn't thermal, it wasn't pressure, it wasn't volume, it wasn't the E term, it was entropic. Next slide. In thermal energy terms, the effect is very large, okay? And exceeds that achievable by a human imprinted IHD. The relics are very powerful, very powerful. Next. And it's not an internal energy, it's entropic. Those relics carry information. Your emotion, that love, is informational. Information is not just zeros and ones of Shannon. It's much, much more than that. Information is very much a physical thing because you make it physical. Okay? Next. So this is what I call thermodynamics of love. We have a way to measure this thing. And it's Buddha's consciousness in a form of a relic. And that we have some parallels between Tiller signs and the Buddha's relics that inform us. that consciousness is much, much more. But it also is lawful with a thermodynamic, that science. It wasn't quantum, it's none of that. And I'm sure that if you did quantum mechanical and differential equations, I'm sure we could go there, but that's awfully hard to do on a tabletop. Okay? This is tabletop. We're putting things on, it's simple. Well, simple to me. Okay. So essentially, this is the second law, and basically we're saying, what Tiller is saying is that you need all of the information. Anytime you generate new information, you reduce disorder. Our cells, when they're talking to each other and exchanging chemicals, they're actually talking to each other. This isn't just chemical exchanges. It's like an informational exchange is happening. But we don't think like that in biochemical terms, although they're getting there. Next slide. So for me, as a medical doctor, this is how I see things, I'm here, chemical medicine, very important. You need chemicals. I'm not saying you do away with that, but we have to use them wisely. But we have to make our patients aware of their biofields, their acupuncture system. Teach them Tai Chi and yoga. Have them really do those disciplines. And when my patients do that, they stop calling me. Okay? They become self-efficacy. It's called they're able to take care of themselves. Then you have information medicine, which is what Tiller is doing, and finally you have spirit. And there's a cascade of healing effects from spirit all the way down. But there's increasing power as you go from chemistry to acupuncture, intention, and spirit. This is what it's really trying to say. But notice, again, chemistry is not less important. I just want to emphasize that. I use chemistry all the time. But I take time to tell my patients about these other aspects that they are in charge. And I could tell you so many stories of my patients, but time doesn't permit me. Next slide. But I want to tell you just very briefly about something that Tiller is doing, and we call it information medicine. Next slide. We have said that this thing is stable, metastable, about 6 months or so, this thing, right, the device. So could you then take that science from the pH and all of that and actually affect a living system, living far away? Because it's non-local. These effects, subtle energies are non-local. They're not electromagnetic. They don't decay over thousands of miles. And so he did a project for autistic children. And, we don't do very well with autism in modern medicine. We think that these children are sick and that we need to do this or put chemical or behavior therapy. I mean, they're all okay, but we haven't found why these children have autism or what to do really about it. So with Susie Miller, she's a speech therapist in Scottsdale. And in fact, this is very interesting. The children told Susie, contact Bill Tiller. And she says, who's Bill Tiller? And so she has these kids who actually told her, these children somehow, and this is where I go, they're entangled with Tiller, entanglement effects. So anyway, Susie got in touch with Tiller, and they set up an experiment, which is ongoing. And autistic children, one of the big things that lags in these kids is speech. They cannot speak. They take a long delay. And so, next slide. So Tiller got to work. He wrote a very specific intention statement to help the children and a separate statement to help the parents, because the parents go through a lot of stress looking after these kids. So the children, there were about 40 of all ages. I think the youngest was 3 and the oldest was 15. They imprinted, 4 of them around a table in Payson, Arizona, at the Tiller Labs. And the device was kept there in a shed. In a shed, okay? The device is like that, and the computer scrolls the names and addresses of the 40 children. I mean, okay? Next slide. So you can see the black star is in Arizona. Next slide. And the information is broadcast throughout the globe. Whoever signed that consent form receives that information. It's a form of subtle energy. And the kids were in Finland, Australia, New Zealand, yes, all over the United States. Immediately the IHD was switched on and the computer is scrolling in that shed, you know. The first parents to call Susie were from Australia, and they said, I don't know, our little girl does not hug anyone. She's very isolated. She sits on a rocking horse or whatever. This kid, they do repetitive behaviors. And that kid, for the first morning, said, Mama, I love you. And Tiller started to cry when he received the news. Mama started to speak, could hug, could sleep. You know, they don't sleep very well. So there's the whole thing of fatigue and confusion in these households. So we gathered data. They did the autism treatment checklist. It's an ATEC. It's a validated form next. So this thing really improved these kids. I mean, it was presented at a national meeting, or rather international meeting. But there's a problem, and I think you may have already gathered. There was no control. How can you do control in an experiment like this? Would you ethically do that? And besides, we know that these things, if you have subtle energy, human energy is not blocked by a plexiglass or a glass or Buddha's relics in Kushinagar in India, where they're being housed in a new Maitreya statue with the objective to radiate that love. Okay? Not to be kept in a case, but to really radiate. The mystics know this physics. They already know. It'll reach where it needs to reach. You cannot do controls. The controls are lost. And I haven't gone into that science of controls and scientific protocols, but the problem here that the reviewers of the paper saw was there's no control. And so it's not been published in a full-length article, which is a real pity, because I think when you have the first new innovative way to find something, it takes great courage for editors, for people like me to sit down and see, what is this physics behind this? Because it's physics, it's not just medicine. And we have to reach across the aisle to other scientific disciplines to really make headway, or we're going to be stuck in chemistry and genetics and immunotherapies and all of these wonderful things we're doing, but it is limited. And I think this, you know how much it costs? You know, an average cost for an autistic kid to have special schooling and all of the doctor visits is hundreds of thousands of dollars. Tiller broadcast to these 40 kids, and I think it was $25 for the year. What if you received your medicine this way 24/7 by a device, and we've done this for certain. Loneliness is another one, self-compassion project. I did this for one of my patients who had arthritis so badly, he gave up. And when I left the clinic, I gave him to one of my colleagues, one of the top in the world, a world's expert. And he called me and said, Nisha, I give you permission to do whatever you want with Mr. J.S. Mr. J.S. called me in Arizona, and I said, okay. He says, I know you're doing this crazy physics stuff, but I'm ready to do anything. So in his case, we worked with him and said, what are your goals? What are your health goals? He says, I don't want any more pain. I want to improve my heart health. I want to be able to ski. He lives in Minneapolis. So we put those things down until I revised the statement until it felt right, until it felt peaceful. And then it was imprinted. And that device was shipped over to Minnesota, and the gentleman receives it and puts it in his home. Personalized medicine. Personalized medicine. So I called JS. It took a while, but 3 years. But I called him. I check in with him to get the data, and he said, "Well, Dr. Manek, I just don't know, but for no apparent reason, my pain's gone." I said, "What do you mean it's gone? Gone? He says, "Yeah, I'm back in the gym, and my muscles have come back." And he couldn't write. He couldn't hold a pen. Okay, you couldn't do things. He's a lawyer. He's a smart guy. He says, "I just want to tell you that for no apparent reason," and he has not had the biologic treatment, which is what we give for arthritis. These are very high, engineered molecules to reduce arthritis activity. He hadn't had biologics for almost 2.5 years. I have never seen a remission like that. Never. I have been in rheumatology for 20 years or so. We see healings, spontaneous healings in cancer. We do hear that there are those case reports, but not in arthritis. It's really surprising. Somehow in arthritis, those spontaneous remissions, I haven't seen in his condition ever. So he's in remission. He's cured. Okay, this is and we've gone through what could have happened. It's an inside-out healing. It's not from the outside in. With modern medicine, we change chemistry and we do things outside. We do operations, change joints, we give steroids, whatever, but it's an outside-in process. With information healing, it's an inside-out. And you could tell Mr. JS was reporting things. But one thing he didn't notice, I asked him many times, "What do you notice about the space in your home?" He says, "I don't know, it feels the same to me. I don't know if it was very subtle, but whatever." He is in remission after hundreds of thousands of dollars of medical care. He just said, "I'll do I'll do this." Crazy as it is, I just somehow feel moved to do it. So we had many phone calls with Tiller, and we narrowed down the intention statement. And this is where the patient and the healer, which is Tiller, collaborated. How many times do you hear that in medicine? Where the doctor says, "What are your goals? What do you want? What do you think the obstacles are?" And it was incredible. He's so joyful. He's just retired, and he's now in his cabins and getting ready for winter, but for the first time can move. So this is awesome. This is what I'm calling information medicine. Okay, next slide. So this is just to say there's no decay. This is not electromagnetism, which decays over, there's a formula for that. And it goes, there's no block. You can put concrete it cannot stop human emotion. These are subtle energies. Next. So I had to put that up there. Next. So the bottom line, develop your gifts of intentionality. Get really clear. Reduce the noise in your mind. You cannot waver and change every 10 seconds, which is really what I do. You're very muddy and really fast, and next thing and the next thing. But Tiller, one thought. Thy will be done. Show me the truth. Literally. So you can take these lessons. They're not that hard. Next. My teacher, Dr. David Hawkins, and I think we're in a very interesting place in human history. We've been Homo erectus, started walking on 2 legs, then we developed a beautiful brain, Homo sapiens, but we're now evolving into Homo spiritus, Homo illumini, Homo universalis. These are all different Homo this, Homo bigger in consciousness from various teachers I've had, and none of them knew the other one. They're all telling me these things. I thought, oh, this is awesome. Homo illumini, Homo universalis in our lifetime, regardless what the media says. Okay? The underneath realities, we are waking up and fast. Next. So our consciousness is evolving. My teacher Vimala says a radical mutation. She means, her word mutation really signifies a change. We are in for a radical change in the quality of human consciousness. And you, because ions, is preparing the ground. You wouldn't be here if you weren't preparing the ground. Why would you spend 7 p.m. listening to some person talking about relics? But you're here. You're preparing the ground. So we are responsible for that. Next. We met His Holiness the Dalai Lama some years back, and Lama Zopa was the director of the tour. So Tiller, that's him on the right, and talking to Lama Zopa there. And Lama Zopa said, yeah, I agree. We need to do experiments on the relics because it is a question of consciousness. It's a vital clue. They get it. Funding is always the issue. You need time, but anyway, he was very happy that we were doing this. Next slide. So it's in the Kurukula Buddhist Center in Boston. Next slide. Okay. I welcome your questions. Thank you for your attention. Thank you so much, really. Tashi Delay.